Elizabeth Hudson joins In the Calm. My beautiful soul sister and friend Elizabeth shares her incredible story of intuition, trust, living in flow, and tuning into the signs that we are given. She is a life and soul coach, Kundalini teacher, actress, mother activist, and the host of the Sexual Alchemy Podcast. You guys, every time we are hanging out together or in conversation, I feel so lifted, seen, and heard, like just deeply inspired. So I cannot wait for you to tune into this conversation and get to experience that as well. You're going to love her stories, her presence, and the messages that we both download in this conversation, the stories that we've both had around really miracles and what it looks like to live with divine intervention, that divine activation and awakening. I can't wait for you to remember your own divine magic. So let's dive in. Welcome to In the Calm. I'm your host, Georgiana Alexander. Elizabeth, welcome to In the Calm. It is such an honor and treat to get to have you here. We've been off camera talking for a while. We're like, we should record now.
Yeah, we're already deep in.
Get lost in our beautiful conversations. You're a Kundalini and yoga and meditation teacher, a life and wellness coach, as well as you host Sexual Alchemy Podcast. You just have a world of background and experience with these beautiful stories and synchronicities, quantum leaps, and deep spiritual experiences. I can't wait to dive into all of it. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, it's such a treat to be here. It's so exciting to get to speak for real about our spiritual journeys and all the magic that's possible.
I love that. I want to get right into the juicy conversations that we've been talking about, our responsibility and openness here in this world and this planet and how we're shifting. But can you back us up to where your spiritual awakening, like where this calling kind of began for you?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny to think about because I think you and I both probably share that we came in this way, right?
Yes. Yes.
We came in feeling a little like, I seem to know things that maybe it's not reflected out on the external world. So I kind of always felt like an outsider as a child. I was always fascinated by witches and witchcraft and all things witch. I use that term with tongue in cheek, kind of a sense of humor. But I think I realized I aligned with having energetic powers, having abilities, having, understanding that the world wasn't as it all seemed and that there was work that could be done to shift and improve. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Improve the reality that we live in. And so I share a story when I do public speaking about, as a young child, I want to say it was like fourth grade, so it wasn't that young, but we were given this thing to ponder over the weekend by our teacher. And she said, I want you to think about what your most valuable possession is. And so, I was at this kind of privileged private school and, rather materialistic. And so I had this 45-minute bus ride home to think about what is my most valued possession. Back then we didn't have a phone to distract ourselves. I had time to daydream and stare out the window. And I started thinking about my imagination, that I could go off into these worlds and I could find freedom and expansion and beauty and creativity and solutions in my imagination. And so my answer was rather unusual. And my answer was my imagination. That is my most valued possession. And I maintain that still, my imagination. And I would maybe change that word a little bit to my higher consciousness. Which is also imagination. So it's access to the more expansive parts of myself, that I know that no matter what is around me, even if I'm in a prison, as long as I have that openness and connection, I can time travel, I can quantum leap, I can live in expansive beauty, and it doesn't have to be reflected in the external world.
I love that so much. And to go back to what you're saying, that on the bus ride home, staring out the window with no phone, I miss those days. I sometimes just hide my phone away and just stare out the window because there's such a peace in just staring up at clouds or, out at a sky. So that's so beautiful, but even more amazing that was your answer and response at such a wise young age.
Well, and I think also when we are born to to help, right? If you see yourself and you purpose in this reality to be of service, right? I've always felt I want to be of service to human consciousness. I want to be of service to human evolution. And what I teach is really, in the most basic terms, I describe it as a remembering that when you go in and you connect to your breath and you connect to source, you are remembering that divine connection that you are a spark of, that you are united with. And to your point about like, if we could only put down our phones and look at the clouds, I mean, unfortunately, the generations now are so disconnected from that feeling of expansiveness and imagination because we are constantly being fed. I describe it this way. It's like, when you read a book and you create that world in your mind, right? And you love that story and you have that whole relationship with the book, and then you watch the movie, it's more often disappointing when it's fed to you, right? Versus what you get to create with your own mind. And too often, and that's very true with our reality too, right? When our reality is being dictated and programmed to us, it's a little flat and boring. Whereas when we have the space to go within, we can channel immense unimagined worlds of beauty versus a flat, one-dimensional, three-dimensional version of things, right?
Tasteless, unfulfilling. And, that's so interesting that you and I both share this vision and understanding of other worlds, right? And so we do have that context. Everybody has that context. It's just about reconnecting to that part of yourself. But so we've both had these experiences of just craving a world to be as we know and feel it can be. And so that really goes back to this imagination. And it's even so much more beyond the imagination because it's the possibility and it is in the quantum realm. Because if you are imagining it, it is an existence for you. And you're able to draw that in and choose to live that and choose to show up for that. But you do have to put down the conditioning of a lot of the world around you, of a lot of the thoughts around you.
Right. And then I think I also, in terms of realizing, what quantum physics has now proven, right? That like if the scientist has a hypothesis, essentially of the outcome of the experiment, that will directly on a atomic molecular level alter and affect the outcome. Now, that very much speaks to our effect on reality, right? That our consciousness then dictates what we see. And so I started seeing that as a young age when I would start imagining things and they would start appearing, right? So I would start wanting circumstances. And then, I wanted to be an actress and I was at a small boarding school in Connecticut, and lo and behold, a casting director showed up and I walked in and she said, "You're the one." And the next thing I knew, I was being flown off to Paramount Pictures to screen test. These are very real dreams that can pop into existence when we realize how powerful our thoughts and our manifesting abilities are.
Yeah, I'm excited for you to share more of these stories because I know you have such incredible stories. But I just love how you put that intention out there of what you wanted. You could see it in your vision, and then it completely materialized for you.
It did, and to the point where I think it even freaked me out, and I pumped the brakes as I was like, whoa.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. How did because a lot of times we have these things happen. And I know that was actually my earlier life was I was able to manifest and create and have things show up so quickly. And people would say, well, you're not doing anything, or you're not working, or that's not what work looks like, or how, you're just lucky, or this or that. And when you start to doubt your natural way of being, which for you, that was your natural way of being. You think it, you visualize it, you want it. Okay, why wouldn't that happen? And so then when we doubt that, we get locked into this other way of being, a more conditioned way of being that isn't our natural state. It's not what's right to us. And we feel lost and we feel like it's very difficult to find your way out of that. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today, is coming back into that trust of our natural states and really honoring that, even when everything around you might be telling you something different.
Being clear on what is my reality and deconstructing and unraveling the layers of programming that most of us start to accumulate from early childhood, right? I remember someone saying rather derisively to me, well, it's like the rules don't apply to you. And I was like, they don't. but I didn't mean that from my ego. And I really didn't mean it from my ego. I meant it from like, they don't apply to you either, but you agreed to them and you signed some kind of invisible contract that you think that they do, that you think that you can't fly, or you can't read my mind, or you can't know what's going to come, or you can't actually affect things. And the truth is you can. And the more we start to awaken that in each other and look in each other's eyes and go, oh, I see that you understand it too. Then we start to get into the divinity that's potential in our humanity. And that's what, when we talk about remember who you are, when we say that to each other, it is about remembering that, this term only human is a fallacy, right? Like when we talk about like, oh, we're flawed. Yes, we're here in this vessel to have this experience and go through Earth School and have the obstacles that we need to learn. But the truth is, we are divine sparks. We are the unity consciousness. And when we can start to awaken, we start to lift off the imprisonments that were really just illusions anyway.
Yes. Well, I see you.
That can sound really scary and really like, what the hell is she talking about?
No, we love this here. And I see this. Like, let's just deep dive into it, because this is what I'm here for. And I see that in you. I can validate that for you. I can tell you, yes, I see you. And yes, for everyone listening, it's 1,000,000% possible for you. Anything that you imagine that is showing up in your heart, in your imagination, in your desires, it is there for purpose, and it is there to help as a little spark, as you've said, as a remembrance. It's there as a gift, as a guide to put you on your path. And so it's time to stop diminishing that light. And you and I were talking about that as people pleasers, as women, as successful women, as attractive women, right? We can name all the different things of all the reasons why it has felt unsafe to show up in our full embodiment of our power, of our light, of our wealth, of our possibilities, of our potentialities. Yeah. And it's just time to support one another on, to say, enough, we're stepping into ourselves.
Yeah. And it's holding compassion. I always knew this to be true. I knew that I would be like my most kick-ass version of myself when I turned 50. Even though like there was nothing in the 70s or 80s that said like 50 was awesome. It was more like, oh, 50 is like a grandma. But intuitively, I was like, no, I'm going to be awesome when I'm 50. And I swear to God, when I turned 50, I was suddenly like, oh, we're kicking it up a notch. This is like the next version of myself that's so much more interesting, that's so much more brave, that has compassion for that other version that was like apologetic and maybe shrunk to be less threatening, or I want other women to like me, so please don't be jealous of me. No, my life's a mess. When you get a compliment and no, you're beautiful, it's right. To really be able to say, I know who I am. I can receive and accept my talents and not feel guilty for them, and feel enormously grateful for my gifts, but also say, I want to be an example or a inspiration, if I can, for what I can invite in each of you. And also recognizing like, it's not all been easy street, right? We have enormous challenges that we overcome. We have enormous flaws that we have to deal with in ourselves. And, holding compassion for myself at the same time, saying I'm not going to hold myself back anymore, or not speak my truth because it might feel threatening or it might get doubted. And so I was sharing with you earlier, one of my mentors, when I said, but if I tell people this, they might think I'm crazy, or and he said, tell your stories, tell all your truths, because that's why you're given these experiences, because you're holding that example of what's possible. But do not be attached to the reactions. Do not be attached to being believed or liked or approved of. And so as hard as that is, right?
Those are powerful words.
Yeah.
Powerful.
And and also realizing that like many will not agree. That might not be others' experience, and that's fine. It took me to get to 50 to say that that's fine.
And for you, do you feel like that it really was just turning 50 and that you had held that? Because I had held that as a kid as like, oh, I feel like I'm not going to come into my life until at least my 40s. I kind of already knew that. It's funny how we know ourselves in different times. But I can't wait for my 50s, 60s, 70s. Like, it just feels like these are my powerhouse years, right? So for you, did you feel like you turned 50 and then it all flooded in? Or are you still finding your step forward? How does that feel for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, if you look at kind of the archetypes of the feminine, right? There's like 3 sections. Like there's the maiden, the mother, the crone. The crone is such an awful word. But if we can start to like empower the crone, meaning the older wise woman who's gone through her life and given up the vulnerability of the maiden and the sacrifice of the mother, and then stepping into this version of ourselves that is awakened, that is wise, that is empowered. For me, it really was like I'd gone through early menopause and realizing that like my hot flashes were actually downloads. Like I have that full-on realization.
Oh, talk about this. I subscribe that menopause is so different than what it's promoted as. And I saw that with my mother.
I want to completely flip the narrative that menopause is this thing you have to suffer through, that it's somehow this diminishing of you, that it's somehow this like, oh, you're being stripped of your beauty or your power. It is actually the opposite. It's not that it's not uncomfortable, because it is. However, you are literally
challenges are that help us really break open our good stuff, right?
Change exactly is uncomfortable. And that's what's happening. You're changing. But what started to come to me, and I was kind of told by my guides, was, oh, you're getting downloads of energy that's up leveling you. So when I would get these, unbelievable hot flashes, right, where it literally feels like a pilot light is turned on inside you and your whole body goes, I was like realizing that I just embraced them and realizing I was being up leveled into my truest power, into my truest wisdom. And I would love to invite more women into that space of realizing that once you earn that part of your life, you can really step into your wisdom, your intuition, and your beauty in a whole different way. That it's so reverse of the narrative that we're fed, right?
1,000,000%. And that is what women need to know. I love that you share that wisdom, because it is so, so, so different than what we have been told for centuries, forever.
Right. And the truly wise cultures, right?
Exactly.
Sorry to overlap. The indigenous cultures that
we're going the same place.
I know. That recognize the wise woman, right? Those were the cultures that honored the earth. Those were the cultures that were more peace-loving, that were more egalitarian versus hierarchical. Those were the cultures that, lived more in harmony, that really revered the wisdom of the older, not only the women, but also the men, but just especially the feminine energy, the old witch in the woods, and the truth is that gets maligned, right? That she's only using her powers for evil, right? And the truth is, a powerful woman is a white witch, that she's able to use in harmony with nature, her natural abilities, in tune with the energy of the earth. And that's, what we all are capable of. And unfortunately, it's been demonized. It's threatening and negative. And like we all know, the witch trials and all the witch hunts over the years have been about suppressing female power, suppressing the midwives, taking the power out of the hands of the midwives or the healers. Right.
And, and I think that in any time and space that there's wisdom, there's been a demonizing of that wisdom. Even now, and we've already talked about, we're not going down this rabbit hole. We could, but we're not. And the demonizing of natural wellness, right? Like it's being torn apart right now. And I mean, this is our wisdom. And when I look to the earth, as I was sharing, I was just hearing something about Veda Austin, who was sharing about the wisdom of the water. We have the elements of the water. We have the crystalline of the earth. We have the herbalism of the earth. We have the energetic fields of the earth. And our bodies are built to work synergistically within that and to uplift and enlighten and empower and radiate, as well as take that in and use it as our own medicine. And so in this disconnection of taking the time to look at the sky or taking the time to breathe in ourselves, we're being disconnected from our wisdom.
Right. And I've been a mindfulness teacher, Kundalini teacher for the last 17, 18 years. And what's interesting to me about that is it's inviting people into that place of going within and finding that connection for themselves. Because the truth is, theoretically, it does not have the same effect as it does experientially. So you can, like in the same way as we can read a book and go, yes, yes, and underline it, exclamation point, dog ear it, but it doesn't necessarily change us. Whereas if we have experience of suddenly going into a deep meditation and having this ecstatic feeling of the Kundalini rising in your body and having a brain orgasm, right? A heart orgasm of having that like expansion of consciousness when you become one with the infinite. If you don't know what that feels like, that sounds crazy. And I would like to give as many people as possible that experience of having that ecstatic connection with the infinite that really is your true nature. And like bypassing religious dogma, bypassing belief systems, it's really just having that experience for yourself and allowing that to be your own spiritual journey rather than something that's prescribed to you. And there's a big difference, right? It's something that you experience innately on your own versus something that is spoon-fed you, right?
Well, I want to go back to something that you said, just to point out, because I know we have so many entrepreneurs and leaders that listen into all around the world in this community. So much of our culture now is about the theoretical. It is about, I'm learning this from a book, I'm getting the certification. And I love that. I love certifications. I do. But I have the certifications to validate. The only reason I've gotten most of my certifications is to validate the experience that I had that wasn't being given credential because it wasn't good enough, that I spent my entire life deep in depth of these practices and these wisdoms and this understanding. So I went and got the piece of paper that matched the learned experience that I had. But so I love that you talk about that, because we do lean in as a culture a lot to the weight of what we're learning, what we're being told, what that looks like. But to get out and have the deeper experiences is where we're going to find our empowerment.
Yeah. Well, and there's nothing wrong with having, certainly the certification and qualifications and the experience, to back it up. I think, unfortunately, what our education system, that's probably a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, but our education system tends to indoctrinate rather than empower, right? So there's two different ways of learning. One is regurgitation, and the other is inviting critical thinking, inviting thought-provoking, expansive thought versus I'm just repeating information that you've given me and I'm memorizing.
Yeah.
Right? And so one thing I really valued in my education in liberal arts, I was an English major and writing and analyzing texts, but it was really valued not just that we regurgitated what we were told, but that we showed our own critical thinking, that we showed our own way of taking in the information and then processing it. And that's true education, right? Being able to critically think, to think for yourself rather than just be, parroting what you're told. That can be disruptive.
That can be disruptive. And that's, I think, what, again, we have felt block. And either, I think it's maybe not just a conditioning, but again, going back to, the witch wound and how we feel threatened to show up. Even as women, even if you don't associate in any of these elements as a witch, or you're like, I don't get what you're talking about with that. But even as a woman, we share the witch wound just by the fact of being in our feminine, right?
Yeah.
And so
you could even call it the bitch wound, right? It's like, if you are strong, how quickly the B word will be slapped on your head.
Yes.
If you show up as confrontative, if you show up as strong, that you will get labeled a bitch really fast. So it's also the bitch wound.
We're going to call it the bitch wound from here on out. This is good. I want to come back to some of the stories that you've hinted towards us. Like, you've got the open floor. I want to know some of the stories that helped you step into this place of at 50, you're like, fuck it, I'm going all in now. And obviously we don't get to that place, like even if we intuit it, without the challenges, without the gifts of the challenges or the experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I haven't told this story in a while, but I feel like it wants to be told. Years ago, I was an actress and I was working in a nightclub in the evenings to make money so I was free during the day. And that to me was just such a toxic environment, being around the alcohol and the sexuality and that, And so I was preparing to go in for a night of, and I think my shift started at 10, which to me now sounds just like hell, right? We had to put on my little.
We're all nodding. We're like, we're getting jammies by now in bed.
Brutal. Yeah. So I had to put on my little hoochie outfit, and it was this very top club at the time in LA. And I was just in this really vulnerable place in my life where I was thinking what does it all mean? What am I doing here? This is all such bullshit. And I really was dreading the night. And so I got down on my knees in front of my altar and I implored God. It was one of those prayers of just, please I can't take it anymore. I am at my wit's end. I'm heartbroken and lost. Please show me a sign. Please show me that I'm not lost or unsupported. And then I got myself together, got to the club. It was this kind of thing where there was a supper club in the front, and then the doors would open to the big club in the back. And so I was there kind of prepping. So it was mostly this big empty cavern of a nightclub at the time, right? And I'm standing there, and there was maybe a busboy or two kind of going in or out, but I was mostly just standing by the bar, kind of prepping the napkins or whatever it was. And all of a sudden I hear this voice behind me. I didn't know there was anyone else in this room. And he says, "Do you have any idea how much God loves you?" And I turned around and I said, "What did you just say?" And there was this African-American man dressed in a suit standing in front of me. And he said, it makes me cry. He said, "God told me to come tell you and remind you. And he wants you to know how much he loves you and how supported you are and that everything is going to be okay." And in that moment, I'm getting emotional talking about it.
Yeah.
I felt this flooding of my crown chakra just opened, and just this pure light pour up through my body. And I started crying and I said, "I can't believe you're saying this. Why are you saying this?" And then I honestly can't remember the rest of the things he told me, but he said, "This is what you need to know right now. And this is what God has told me to tell you." And then he walked away, I think. I mean, I don't remember him disapparating or anything, but I never saw him again. But I was still in this like state of ecstasy of receiving this, of literally an answer to a prayer I'd asked half an hour ago. And I just felt like, oh my God, I have to go be alone for a minute. So I kind of had to push my way through the nightclub to get to a bathroom. And this person just grabbed me and they said, "Oh my God, you're just glowing. Like you're just on fire." And I was like,
I have chills. Yeah.
I know. But that was such a beautiful, just an immediate message. And I always think of that whenever I feel lost, or, that those answers are right there. And, I feel like that was such a beautiful gift reminder when I was lost.
That's incredible. I can see, I'm watching the image and the outplay as you're talking about this and see this. And I just want to go back to say, for everyone listening, I mean, that's the thing, is I think most people don't realize, and you and I have had such visceral experiences within that realm of the answers are immediate. That is, we're very tapped into what everybody's now, like the quantum field, right? It's so immediate. We are tapped into that consciousness, into that truth. And everyone has the ability to do that. And the answers are literally at the tip of your ask.
Yes. And that is such an important thing to say, because I've told that story and I've had people say, "Well, why doesn't that happen to me?" And what I want to speak to is that it is for all of us. That isn't just my message. That is for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
When we are wondering, am I guided? Am I supported? Does God love me? That message was for all of us. Right. God loves you. God loves you. It's not specific. It's to all of us.
1,000,000%. Yeah. You and I have had similar experiences in terms of being guided and finding our pathways and having things show up. But just to kind of validate, I mean, I haven't talked about this story in a while. I'm going to share with you because it just ties into this person that you saw, right? Mm-hmm. So I was 15 and driving in a car. I was not driving. I was the passenger. It was about 9:00 at night on Super Bowl Sunday. I was with a friend and we were leaving one friend's house to go to my house. It was less than a mile away. And I hear my guides. I'm already very, clairaudient at this point. I'm already hearing everything. And so my guides scream in my ear, "Put your seatbelt on now." And I'm like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I'm being the bratty teenager. So as she is lifting her foot off the brake, I click my seatbelt and we're impacted. She is pulled out in front of a car going about 40, 50 miles an hour on a 2-lane, or it's a wider lane road than that. Like you have to go to a median and then cross over. So the car, the window is busted in, half of my cornea in my eye is cut off. And I'm thinking, okay, well, this is it. I look at her once the car stops spinning, the windshield is busted in. There is blood. I'm not going to get into details, But it looked like because I don't want to gross anybody. Like if someone's listening, I don't want them to be like, oh.
Right.
But so she was pinned in the car and it did look like she was no longer with us. She did look dead. And I get out of the car and I can still see, I've got some glass in my eye, but I can see, and I have full presence and awareness of everything happening. And to my right, I was on the passenger side. So to my right is a field of wheat. There's nothing there. Right behind me is a bright light, like a lamppost light. There is an African-American man that comes walking from that light. He's wearing a very white shirt. And it was such a contrast to his beautiful dark skin to the whiteness of that shirt. And it was like this pristine glow that he had. And obviously people are like, maybe you had glass in your eye. But no, you can know what you see. And so my other eye worked just fine. He walked up to me and I looked at him and said, oh my gosh, like, am I bleeding? Is my face bleeding? Because the airbag had busted my nose. And my nose was bleeding. And one of my eyes had glass in it and half the cornea out. And he takes his shirt off and hands it to me and is very calm and very slow and says, you're fine. Everything's fine. You're just fine. Everyone is okay. And I'm like, no, but I feel like I'm bleeding. He's like, it's just your eye. You're going to be just fine. Here, take my shirt and you're okay. And so then I turn my head and look back to the driver that's hit us because she's now getting out of the car. And in a split second, I just yelled to her, call 911. I didn't say that to the man in front of me, right? Which was odd, not odd, right? Because we know. Right. And so then as I look back, he'd completely dematerialized. He was vanished. I was holding his shirt in my hand and he was completely gone. I looked, there was no one in the field. So we do have these people. It's like there's so often, and you and I could tell millions of these stories. I've had so many of these moments in my life of physical divine intervention as well as the non-physical, as well as the love and support is so surrounded. If we even knew how much we are loved in this whole universe, in every cell of our being, that we are loved and that we are loved, I think it would just blow people wide open. Like they couldn't even understand how big that love is. Yeah. I share that story to validate your story. It was just incredible. That was like
chills, full affirmation chills.
Yeah.
And the truth is, if it's not necessarily something that you've been experiencing in this world, just know that it is possible. And so part of it is deconstructing and peeling away the layers of programming that keeps us from the vibration of those possibilities. And so, I had, when someone said, well, maybe you had glass in your eye and you did see this light or whatever. I mean, at the time I had a boyfriend who said, yeah, well, he was probably just hitting on you. That's like, okay. Oh my God. And it was a little like, well, I'm sure going to miss you. I guess, because, we can't afford to have those near and dear to us to say, what is not true or what you're experiencing is invalidated just because it's not something that they're necessarily experiencing. I've even had circumstances where I've had witnesses to events that even then get doubted. And so it's just holding that space of the miracles are there if you're willing to see them. The miracles are there if you're willing to see them.
Yes. And if you have an open heart and mind to that too. And that's, again, if you want to see them. And when you say see, not just see with your physical eyes, but see with your heart, with your mind, being open. My reality might be very different than your reality, even though we're standing in front of each other. And so the people that surround you may not be the best indicators of what is right for your life. And you have to really go inward to align to that and trust that and step forward in that, because you don't know, maybe you're the one meant to shake up the wasp nest of what's around you. Maybe that is your purpose. And so if you back down from that or don't stand up, and what I mean by standing up is you don't have to become the world's next activist. That could just mean telling yourself you trust yourself, telling yourself you love yourself. Like that is the act of belief, right?
In some ways that can be a radical act in and of itself, right? And, it's like you were saying about healing your own trauma and how that retroactively heals generations of trauma, And then when we hold that space for being healed versions of the feminine, that changes. I get this image often of like, there's these scales of energy on the planet, love and fear, right? And that there's so much fear and it's just gotten so heavy on that side. The more that we hold a space of self-acceptance and love, the more that we're balancing those scales out. So when people say, but look, there's so much suffering in the world, who am I to be joyful? Who am I to be happy? The truth is you actually hold a responsibility to hold that vibration to balance the scales a little bit, because somebody's got to.
Well, that's what we were talking about beforehand, is like, it really is where you put your energy into. And right now I get asked this question in my community often, is like, with so much going on, how do we show up in the space of hope and love and in moving forward? Like, people almost feel guilty to not go in and dive into the fear and into the fear mongering and into everything that's encompassing that. What I believe is that's not the answer. The answer, just as you've said, is to go in the love, is to live your life and be that beacon of light. What do you share with your community when they come to you and ask what are steps to stay in that love and help radiate truth versus feeling guilt to dive into the fear narrative?
That's a really tricky thing, to stay out of the collective narrative, right? Because we have to start to be discerning in terms of what we let in energetically and what we consume. Let's put it that way. We have to be discerning with what we consume. So that's not just what we, ingest. It's about what we allow in our energetic field as truth, right?
Yes.
And so we have to start to question the narrative. How does it make me feel when I listen to 24-hour news or have that on in the background all the time? How does it make me feel when I watch certain programs that have incredible violence? How does it feel watching porn, right? Participating in the culture of the explicit sexuality. What does that do to my energetic system? When we start to question a lot of the normal, right, we start to feel a little disconnected from the society as a whole, because a lot of this is this culture of wanting to be a part of the collective, but realizing that, like, we have to forge our own path if we want to have our own experiences and our own enlightenment. And sometimes that's making hard choices of, like, I'm not going to participate in a belief system, or I'm going to start to question things that I had previously believed that I thought were absolute truths. That can start to feel uncomfortable because it's pulling a thread that can start to disravel a whole belief system that maybe we had bought into. But when we work on ourselves from the inside out, we realize that's all just ego, that our belief systems give us this illusion of safety, and that it's not true safety, but it's this illusion of being right. So I'm right in my version of God. My God's better than yours. I'm right in my version of political opinion. I'm right in my version of, whatever it is, however we identify ourselves, and realize when we go deeper in ourselves that those are just constructs of identity that aren't really who we are. And that can be very uncomfortable when we've fought really hard to defend our personality and defend our ego, to start to deconstruct that. But then that's the liberation. That's breaking out of, as my guide showed me, the web around the third dimension of this consciousness. I know, go with me here for a minute.
I'm here with you. I am here with you.
I know you are. But I like to offer it as a visualization, because it was shown to me as a visual that there really is this web of fear. It is a web, and it is holding a certain consciousness. And if we think about, as you talk about quantum leaps, quantum experiences, when we are in one energy field, the only way to disengage from it is in a quantum leap, is in a leap in consciousness that has to release from the old system. And that is not comfortable. That requires a wrenching out of our egos, of what we previously held as true, maybe accepting some uncomfortable truths of realizing that things aren't as we thought they were.
We've lived it. I know you and I have. I know everyone listening, like, there's been these moments, and even to give visualization to that for everyone listening, I've had moments where I needed to make a big quantum leap. I was in an environment that was quite toxic, or a household that was quite toxic, and I didn't see the road ahead. It was about to be a big gap, between the bridge. And it was like I was going to crash and fall if I didn't take a leap. Like, it was hitting the end of a road, and I couldn't just stop, in other words. And the message that I got from my guides is, they said, close your eyes, like, energetically, close your eyes. Okay. Anything that you see that you think is happening right here now, shut your eyes to. You're not going to look at this. Go and take one step forward, go to the Starbucks, get your coffee, or the little simple things that bring you joy, and associate to that. And don't worry about the how. Don't worry about the rest. Find your joy. Take the little step. Close your eyes to the reality you think you live in. Within, I want to say, the window of maybe a week and a half, my house was in a completely different place. My life was in a completely different place. It was so fast. My reality looked entirely different. The part of the city I was living in, entirely different. Like everything was a huge leap.
And that is exactly that.
That's the quantum leap, right? And those quantum...
inexplicable.
Yeah, they can happen in these small little moments. They don't have to be quite that drastic, but I tell those stories because everything is possible. And I do think, as you and I were talking about off camera, like in the culture of where we are now, where everything feels so uncertain and known, I just want to give validation for everyone listening. Sometimes those pressure cookers are important for people that need that reality to wake up, to remember who they are. If you don't need that reality, don't engage in it. Don't associate. Follow your guidance as to what is aligned to you, and then live in that, because you then become the beacon. You then become the activist. You don't become the activist by going in and all drowning together. You become the activist and the beacon by shining your light and sharing with others. There's another way. There's the way of truth and love and heart and harmony and acceptance.
That is such a beautiful way of putting, like in yogic terms, we kind of describe it as the path of karma versus the path of dharma, right? So karma is kind of more of the entanglements of cause and effect, right? That you have to kind of learn the hard way. And, I've always pushed back when people say, if I hadn't gone through that, then I never would have learned X, Y, and Z. Or if I hadn't gone through all that hard stuff. And intuitively, I feel like that's not necessarily true. Like your destiny is your destiny. You don't necessarily have to go through all the pain and suffering. Often in the human condition we do, but there is the dharmic path, which is really that more direct route of being in your higher self, holding that space of the eagle perspective, of that kind of higher understanding, not having to drag ourselves through as much pain and suffering. It's possible, right?
I agree. And when we look at, as I was sharing my upbringing with abuse and things like that, as a child, I felt this very strange sense, because I was very tuned in, like, oh, this is a part of my journey. But I didn't hold attachment to what it meant, to what it was, to what that equated. And I still don't. But what I do find in the challenges, rather than the attachment of saying, I needed that in order to X, Y, Z, what I really needed it was almost the adverse. I went through the challenges to recognize, oh shit, I didn't need to go through that. I could have just trusted my instincts. I could have just, as you said, aligned to my dharma, and I wouldn't have necessarily needed the challenges in the same way. So I think it depends on what perspective you're taking and looking at them.
Yeah. And I think, like we said, sometimes, something like abuse in childhood, for me, it opened up my ability to kind of go out into a deeper connection to spirit. Sometimes we do need these in our human vessel, these catalysts, right? Let's call it that. A challenge is an opportunity to push us into the next space. And the truth is, we don't remember our past lives. We don't remember all the journey of our soul up until this incarnation, usually. And we have this very short window that we have to get it right here on Earth School, right? And learn the lessons quickly and remember who we are. And so, a lot of that is the challenge of this incarnation, is remembering and not falling prey to the illusions.
I agree entirely with you. And also, it's a perfect segue into, I really want you to share more about the teachings that you do within Sexual Alchemy, using our sexual empowerment and embodiment in our healing and in rediscovering ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I felt very called to do this podcast, which, I said to you, if you had told me I'd be doing a podcast about sexuality, I never would have believed it. That felt very uncomfortable and strange, and oh my God, that would be crazy. And yet, it was one of those things when you're kind of following intuitive guidance, you just accept. And so I did, and I started this podcast called Sexual Alchemy, which is about conscious sexuality. It's about healing the sacral chakra. So if we talk about our pelvic area, it's called the sacral, right? The sacrum of the pelvis. That is our sacred area where creation stems from. So the literal reproductive obviously, but also our creative energy in our body, and how potent we are as human beings when we are able to consciously direct that energy versus kind of negatively siphoning it off. Too often, our world, if you look at over and over again, a sex scandal is usually the downfall of most powerful men, right? They did something that they shouldn't have done. They were driven by their pelvic region in the wrong direction. And it's so often, but there is so much suffering and pain, dysfunction, and confusion around the sacral chakra. So my intention in creating the podcast was to have conscious conversation about how do we shift that? How do we shift the narrative from on some level, we're taught that sexuality is a sin, that there was this shame around sexuality.
It's our power. It's
exactly
such a power source.
But if you're being taught that on some level to your subconscious, it's saying on some level, your very existence is shameful.
Right.
And there really has to be a complete overhaul of that narrative, and that we can start to look at sexuality as a beautiful exchange of energy that ultimately is heart-centered. I do some activism around awareness around porn and sex trafficking and things like that. And the truth is, there is so much sadness around sexuality. There's so much shame inherent. And I really see this, I hold this potential for beauty in our sacred energy exchange. And that there is hopefully more and more coming into consciousness and healed expression of sexuality that doesn't have to involve the pain that it has in the past. I feel very passionate about it, and it's something that I care deeply about.
There is so much I would love to dive into with this. So I think we will have to have another conversation about this on sexuality alone, because there's just so much unknown and so much unsaid for most people around their sexuality, around what sexuality even is. And coming from an energetics perspective, I love delving into my own personal sexuality, especially coming from a background of having dealt with abuse, and then what that looks like of reclaiming my own sexuality and not being dimmed by having a strong sexuality. So seeing the balance of our feminine and masculine within ourselves and how that heals, and how we can honor that with the men in our lives as women, or how the men can really honor our feminine and we can help nurture that for one another. Yeah. And also just about the conversation around porn and the porn industry. I had some friends that were inadvertently around porn on distribution and things like that. So I would see things or hear stories, as well as just having experience with seeing porn and pornography. And I think people are saying, well, what's wrong with porn? So let's talk. I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down, but when what you are watching brings an energy of fear, control, enslavement, and it's not from a place of integrity, right, then you're taking that into your body and telling your body that that's what sexuality is. So it's about deconditioning sexual conversations to really align for sexuality, for what that really looks like, because that's where you're going to have the most incredible orgasms. And that's where you're going to feel wholly fulfilled in your whole system, because that's what our sexuality is for, is not just our sex organ. It's for activating an intimacy and empowerment through our whole system.
Exactly. And channeling that divine realm into this time and space. It's really being a vessel for pleasure, which is literally higher realms. So my guides told me once that pleasure is your portal to the higher dimensions. And so when we are in pleasure, we open up into these more vast, expansive spaces. And orgasm takes us into that like obliteration of the ego, right? The little death, the obliteration of this container, this limited body, into that expansive consciousness. And the truth is that space always exists. We're just in this heavier dimension that we don't get to experience that. But the truth is, the more we open up to pleasure and joy, we open these vast portals to higher dimensions. Sexuality is a portal. It can also take us down into darker dimensions. It's about how it's used, right? Pornography, I don't want to demonize, other than it is, you have to be very clear of what you're engaging in, and that it too is a portal, and it too is a disassociation from your own connection to your sexuality. And there's a disconnect and a numbing that often happens. that can be very dark and very desensitizing. And, I've heard story after story of young men and women who are just so desensitized by the overuse and overexposure to pornography that their intimacy is lost in the experience, that they are almost outside their own body while they're having their own connection because they're in their head in a visual of this kind of disconnect is the best way I can put it.
And we were talking about earlier about our imagination and the power of our visions, right? And so when we place ourselves in something, it's always been so fascinating to me because we see different images in media and people that we want to emulate, right? But what are we emulating? What are we putting ourselves actually into? Because I don't think we understand that on an energetic side, we're actually putting ourselves into someone else's reality when we associate and attach in those ways. And so that's where it's so important to be aware of what you are associating and attaching your vision and your imagination to.
Right. And that goes back to like consuming, like what we're participating in, what we're taking in energetically. Yeah, it's really powerful. Let's just start to be more conscious about, how if I have this magic energy within me in terms of my sexual creative energy, if we want to look at it that, like, how can I use it in a way that will be more expansive versus more contracting? Just kind of, and then we can look at every scenario. Is this giving me more expansion, or is this contracting me more into fear, more into darkness, more into something that doesn't?
And then finding the ways in your life that really following that pathway, following the gifts that you're being given of, oh, that expands me. I'm going to go there. I'm going to do more of this. And then watch your life transform. The way that we actually connected, just to share this story a little bit, because I love this, was that you had we have a mutual friend who's amazing. Shout out Mariana. But we connected online. I reached out after seeing a post that you did talking about how your sister during COVID went into cardiac arrest and then subsequently into coma and is now fine. Just to let everybody know. But yes, thank goodness. But that whole experience and with the lockdown really pushed you into finding something to break through fear. Do you want to share a little bit about that? I love how you dive into fear as an expander.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right. Because there's two choices in that moment, right? To go into more fear or to fight through it and get to the other side of it. Yeah. So as you explained, my sister, my 46-year-old younger sister, went into cardiac arrest. This was in the beginning of COVID. So it was maybe like the summer in 2020. She dropped dead on the floor of a convenience store. Fortunately, she was out of her house. She was able to be somewhere where she was, around people who could get paramedics to her quickly. They were able to revive her, but she was in a coma for 2 to 3 months. And it was such a surreal time for me because here I am, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's so many bizarre things going on in the world. I'm in the middle of a divorce. I've got, just so much going on the micro as well as so much going on the collective. Couldn't even get across the country to see her. So I'm experiencing this. It all felt very surreal. And there were days where, we couldn't even go out of our house here in LA. We weren't allowed to go to parks. We weren't allowed to go to public beaches because of COVID. However, then they changed it that you could go to beaches. And so I decided in this moment of impulsivity or something that drew me, I'm going to take a surf lesson. So I was 48 years old and I'd never done it before. And I just called someone that I knew and said, can you take me at 4:00? And he's like, well, the waves are going to be huge and it's going to be really hard. And I was like, I don't care. I'm going. And so I went and got my butt kicked. I got up, the first couple of tries, which was amazing. And I loved it. And it was terrifying. And I got completely pummeled by the waves, but I felt like knocked back into my body. I felt alive. And I felt like I needed that physical reminder of just facing my fear and going into the cold water and being thrown around. And it gave me so much empowerment in facing something that I could not control, right? Realizing that in the same way that you can't control a wave, you just have to go with it. You have to flow with, what comes. It just allowed me to process the pain of that circumstance in an empowering way rather than feeling victimized and overwhelmed. And so I do try to do that as much as I can in life. If something scares me, I'm terrified I'll put it this way. Another version of myself was terrified of public speaking. And then life was like, well, you're going to be an actress and you're going to be on a stage teaching people. And, so you just have to
dive in.
You don't get to indulge those fears.
Yeah. It breaks you wide open in the best way possible. That's how we met, is I saw this and I'm like, I have to reach out and talk to you. And then in chatting and sharing your stories, I'm like, you have to be on the podcast as well.
Thank you. Well, I
just
love
have
that,
too
because you
many
never
incredible
know
stories.
who your messages are going to reach. So
It's very inspired and feel and live the same way. But I think so many people don't. And then they look to us and ask, well, how do you do that? Well, you dive into the fear and it breaks you open. And so that kind of segues. I want you to, if you would, please share your story about that you shared with me about your kidnapping.
Yes, of course.
How that broke you open. That was incredible.
Thank you. And it is a little bit of that, like, you don't have to know the how of it. It's that saying, leap and the net will appear. Sometimes it really is faith over fear. And it's that simple, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's such a surreal story, but I was kidnapped at gunpoint maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I don't remember exactly,
Wow.
and it was, I often say it was the most profoundly spiritual experience of my life, because I have never felt so protected and so supported. And you talk about going into those states of connection to our guides or connection to, those higher energies. I was up in Santa Barbara, California, visiting a friend. It was twilight, maybe in late November. And, there were premonitions, in the same way that you had that click your seatbelt.
Mm-hmm.
I was just talking about how people on heroin must feel connected to angels. Why was I saying that? I don't know. I don't even know why that conversation was happening. No idea.
I have chills. I don't know, but there was a premonition, right?
Literally saying to my friend that it must feel like, I've never done heroin, but that you feel the angelic realm around you. And that warm, the way people describe it is that being in that warm, space of the angelic realm. Well, the next thing I know, there's a knock on the door, and she goes to answer the door. And it's in those moments where time starts to go wah, 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 and everything started to slow down. And then I heard her, because I knew what was coming, and I heard her scream, and she was thrown up against the wall. And then this young man came in with a gun to her head. And in that moment, it's that, I just felt this unbelievable, I don't know, almost felt like I was lifted off the ground, like that this cold space of like thousands of angels came in behind me. That's the visual that I got. Just this army came in. And I went eerily calm, right? Because it's often, you go into that. And he said, he was holding the gun to us, and he said, I need money. He was explaining that he's a heroin addict, that he was going through withdrawal, and he needed to get drugs. And then he said, I have something for you. And we're standing in her kitchen, and I'm thinking, oh, dear Lord. And then he opened his backpack and he handed us angel pins.
No. What?
Angel pins. So I'm getting like, it's all going to be okay. Everything's okay. And so something opened in me. And I can honestly say, I don't think I was consciously saying the words that I was saying, but what came through me was pure love and compassion. And I made, I'm shaking talking about this. I made a very clear decision in that moment that if our karmic contract between he and I was that he was going to end me, that I already forgive him. I made that very clear decision. I already forgive you, because I do not want karmic entanglement with you any further. And if we have past to clear up, I already forgive you. So this ends now. And then from that space, I said to him, he made us get in the car. He was in the back seat holding the gun. My friend was driving. I was in the passenger seat. And I spoke to him the entire time. And I said to him, I understand you're in pain. I understand you're suffering, but you are not evil, and you are not going to hurt us. And I just kept reassuring him over and over again that he was not going to hurt us. And I know you're not going to kill us. And I know you're not wanting to do this. I understand your suffering. And my friend's looking at me like, what are you doing? And I couldn't even explain why I was saying these things to him.
I have such chills. You're just channeling.
And he finally broke down. We were driving on the freeway, and he said, you're right. I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm in the grips of the devil, is what he said. I'm in hell, and I can't get out, and I don't know what to do. And I said, I understand, but you're not going to hurt us. And he said, no, I'm not. And then we pulled over by the side of the road, and he looked at me, and he looked at me with so much kind of shame and pain in his eyes. And I said, God loves you. It's okay, And he said, I'm sorry. And he got out of the car, and he let us drive away. And what we learned later was that he had stolen the gun from his father and actually loaded it. So, he could have been holding an empty, unloaded gun, and it would have made the difference. They picked him up within 15 minutes after that. But for me, it was one of the biggest examples of there is that dynamic of when you act like prey, you invoke the predator, right? I mean, if you just think about like in the wild, if you encounter a wild animal, if you run, their instinct is to chase you, right? So if I change the vibration from I hate you, you're a horrible monster, to oh, you poor thing, what's happening to you? I'm so sorry that you're in pain. In this case, it changed the energy, I believe.
The love and compassion and the channeling.
I can't say that would always work, but I do believe that when we hold a higher frequency, we invite others into that space as well. And that solutions are possible from that space that are not in other more reactive spaces.
Wow. I mean, this story, you had told me parts previously, but when I hear it again, and then the part about you saying ahead of time, talking about the angelic realm and heroin, and then his backpack was full of angel buttons.
Yep.
I mean, just all of the different pieces. You don't know, maybe that was the cry for help that he needed, and you being able to step into compassion and love in a really grounded consciousness shifted not only your life forever, but his life forever. Maybe he got the help that he needed and that he was asking for. So amazing how these moments show up for us and how you have the choice. It's very distinct choices that you get to make in these moments.
Yeah. And that was the powerful lesson to me was I really didn't feel fear in the moment. I felt this divine support. I felt, all the while seeing the kismet synchronicities, blowing my mind. I was just talking about the heroine and the angels, and here comes the heroin addict with the angels. You can't make this stuff up, right?
Yeah, I know.
It's just like, it's those, what I take those as, those are the winks of God, from God, right? Like coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Have you ever heard that? But yeah, it's those moments where you realize like none of this is random. This is all divinely orchestrated. We're just players in the great scheme of it.
And it's so fascinating how you talked about time getting wonky. And I think it's in those moments when we're experiencing things where our time slows, that's when we have these experiences of the real picture of reality, when we can feel that offset of our day-to-day life and our busyness and our conversations. It's when these moments slow and you can see the way energy moves and you can see the moments of, okay, here it goes. We're lining up the story for you. We just gave you the message about the person that's coming in. And then you felt the download and you felt the channel of how to show up in that situation. And as you said, you could have done it a million different ways that would have led to an outcome. And that's really the interesting thing that we see in those moments is those choices and the distinction of our choices that we forget about when we're in the busyness of our lives, I think. But those choices are still just as poignant and powerful in our day-to-day lives. It just might not be seemingly life or death.
Right. Very, very true. Yeah. And then also taking the time to connect to those more subtle senses within ourselves is really what I teach as a coach and a teacher, is that the more you quiet down and go within, you realize you have this superpower of subtle senses that aren't as obvious as our externalized five senses. The more you tune into them, the more available they are to you. And in that space, you get to experience these synchronicities and kismet and magic all the time. I mean, I really do love that phrase. I rely on miracles. I don't believe in miracles. I rely on them.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the quantum experience of realizing that there's all these interdimensional spaces that we can participate in, and we get to choose which one we want to participate in with where we put our attention. And when we give into vibrations of fear and lack and scarcity, then that is the world that will be reflected to us. And when we go into our imagination and envision worlds of beauty and possibility and dreams coming true, then we get to activate that into our material world. And it's not just for us. It's really the message is that we are all capable of it.
We're all capable of it. Exactly. I think you and I haven't necessarily talked about this, but I've had 3 near-death experiences. And I'm not going to dive into all of them or anything, but the common thread, I'll share it with you later. And I've shared it in another episode, so you guys can listen if you want to hear. But the commonality of these experiences and that I've seen in my near-death experiences, as well just through my life, but in those moments of when you are faced with death, or when you're faced with, just like you said your prayer before you went into work, and then you received the angel message, these moments where you have just had it, it's just such a contrast, right? Of this or that, something has to change, or in this moment of life and death. But the thing is, we have the opportunity every day. It's in the small choices of joy that connect us with consciousness and the truth of who we are, and that you get to make those decisions about the way that your life shows up and what, as you said, is what we get to draw in. So many people think, oh, well, that's just them. They're super intuitive and they've been this way since birth. But we've had the experiences to help validate the truth of this. And that's, I think, the difference is, we have been watching, we've had very extreme situations that have helped us really, really deeply know that what we're seeing and experiencing and what is possible is the truth, and that everything else is the untruth. We've had this beautiful conversation, and I can't wait to actually dive into a part 2, because there's so many areas, especially with the sexuality and empowerment of sexuality and things like that, I would love for us to go deeper into. So we'll have to have you back and share more. So to tap into what you could leave with everyone listening about how you like to tap into these moments of joy, of how you like to connect to what ultimately is quantum leaps, right? Even in the small moments of joy. What does that look like for you? What do you share with people that you work with or for yourself?
Thank you. And that's such a good point, is that, we're sharing these stories not to in any way separate ourselves. It's really sharing them to offer something that's possible for all of us, right? So that knowing that this is available as truth. Right. So what I love to teach is, again, that remembering of when we go into our deeper breath, when we go into our third eye, we're going into that imagination, to bring it back full circle, is that we're starting to open up into those spaces of our subtle senses that is part of our energetic system. And if we start talking about the quantum leaps, right? Like in any moment, there's a choice of multiple different realities, right? That we're making a choice in that moment of what we're going to give energy to. And you can distill it down to 2 choices, love or fear. Right? That we are making a choice either in a more fear-based direction or in a more love-based direction and a more faith-based direction. And it really is how we dictate throughout our day, how we react to circumstances. Do we let that take us down into a spiral, or do we have the objectivity of our own minds to pull ourselves out? So what I like to offer to people is there's always the third option. You have your positive mind, you have your negative mind, but you have your neutral mind, which is that higher perspective. And you can call it your higher self, your eagle eye. It is that part of you that has the whole perspective of your soul's journey in the knowledge of the archives, right? That it's all there for you. And that from that space, you don't always have to believe what you think, right? We don't have to get caught up in the machinations of the monkey mind. We can really be the objective observer of our own consciousness. And that is consciousness, right? It's realizing that you are, again, the creator, creatress of your reality. And so having a meditation practice, I know that gets so cliche after a while, but it really is
true.
It's just true. It's just true. And it's really the tool that starts to shift us out of believing so much in the third dimension. I often, when I teach beginners, they have such resistance to keeping their eyes closed, but I realize that's not a space you're used to exploring, or it might be uncomfortable. I've had students admit to me, oh, I hate sitting with my thoughts. Well, okay, but then all the more reason we need to refine that, right? And because what we run from, that monster starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger the more you run, right? You turn around and face it, it shrinks down to a mouse, right? But it's all about what we give energy to. And so the more we run from our fears, the more we usually, unfortunately, tend to exaggerate them.
That's so, so beautifully said. I know for me, personally, I love to make a fear list every year of things that really kind of frighten me to do, whether it's, trying new things or experiences or whatever, or lofty goals. And it's really interesting because when you do diminish that fear and you start breaking down the steps of how to work through certain fears, in some cases, like with your surfing, you just dive right in, right?
Yeah.
I'm a surfer too, so I love surfing analogies. Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. And so when we dive right into these things, sometimes you might not even like it. Sometimes it might be nothing that you're going to stick with. But in the practice of looking at our fears, sitting with our thoughts, or tuning into what is our joy, and then moving more into that space, you really get rooted and validated in who you are and what makes you tick. And then that is an empowerment that nothing and no one around you can take away from you.
Exactly. And then it, the fear takes on less power. It just doesn't have the same hold over us. And always remembering, I think this is so important. I distilled my friends down to like people who make me laugh and those who don't. And I just don't have too much time for people who I can't laugh with. And really, so much of life is the big cosmic joke, right? That there is that higher part of ourselves that just looks down at the absurdity of it all and realize it's all a play. It's all okay. And it's funny. It's funny. And laughter frees up any negative energy. When you laugh, they're really I always think of the movie The Witches of Eastwick when they're falling and she says, laugh. And the laughter bolsters her up. I don't know if you've seen that, but if you haven't,
it's been a long time ago.
It's worth revisiting. But if there is something true about that, right? When we're faced with fear, we're faced with darkness, laughter, that joy, the expression of joy frees up all that heavy energy.
That's such a beautiful reminder. So powerful that our joy and laughter lifts us up. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, sharing your light with us. It's such an honor to get to converse with you. And I can't wait to have you back on and do a part 2 here of some of these rabbit holes that we
Thank you.
Just lightly touched on. So everyone, check out the show notes for all the ways that you can connect with Elizabeth. And also reach out and let us know the areas in your life that you have resonated with the things that we're sharing today or that you want to learn more about. We'd love to answer your questions and connect with you on what that looks like for you.
Yeah, and hear your stories. I love hearing people's stories. So
same.
Share your miracles. That's the message.
Yes,
share
your miracles. I love it.
Thank you so much.
See you soon. Thank you so much.